Okay, now we are on to the muscles that move the humerus. This means these muscles all insert on the humerus. The action is going to be at the shoulder joint. Remember, the shoulder joint is a ball and socket joint. It is one of our most flexible joints with lots of movement, lots of action. So make sure you have this muscle grouping action sheet out, because you're going to be filling it in as we go through these muscles. So we're going to be doing flexion and extension of the shoulder joint, ab and adduction of the shoulder joint, and internal and external rotation at the shoulder joint. So let's get started. So make sure you have your master list out so you can follow along. We are going to start with the deltoid. Now the deltoid is a superficial muscle. You can easily see it there. And the deltoid, what's interesting about the deltoid, just like the trapezius, it has three parts. So we're going to call this the anterior part, the medial or middle part, and the posterior part. It's a very strong muscle, and you all remember where it inserts into the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. Let's isolate this guy and look at that. So here is the anterior portion, and you can see its origin. So if you look at your master list, you'll see the origin of the deltoid. It's the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. And then we're going to go into the medial portion, which is going to be this part right here, which is going to be the acromion process of the scapula. And this posterior portion is going to be the spine of the scapula. So this deltoid, its origin basically is wrapping around the shoulder joint right here. And its insertion is in that deltoid tuberosity on the lateral side of the humerus. So let's just look at the actions of the anterior portion of the deltoid. Now this is a pretty strong muscle with lots of muscle fibers. If the anterior portion is contracting predominantly, it will be pulling on the humerus here, and it will be bringing that shoulder joint, moving the humerus forward. It's going to pull the humerus forward, so that will give you shoulder flexion. If it keeps on contracting, it's going to eventually cause the shoulder joint to have some internal rotation. So that will give you internal rotation. So write that down on your list, and we'll go through these actions at the very end again. So anterior portion is going to give you shoulder flexion, and if it keeps on contracting, it's going to give you that internal rotation at the shoulder. This middle portion, now this middle portion, easier to see it here, this middle portion is right in the middle. And where is it inserting? Oops. And where is it inserting? It's inserting on the lateral part of the humerus. So when this middle portion contracts, it's going to go I to O. It's going to go straight up. It's going to lift your arm straight up. And what is this going to give you? I to O. That basically is going to give you abduction, abduction. And in fact, this middle portion of the deltoid is the primary mover of abduction. Now the posterior portion of the deltoid. Bring you over here. If we get the posterior portion of the deltoid, remember it's inserting on the lateral portion of the humerus. If the posterior portion contracts, it's going to give you shoulder extension. It's going to bring the shoulder back. And if it keeps on contracting, it's going to go in this direction. It will give you shoulder external rotation, lateral rotation. So write that down on your grouping. So basically, the deltoid, 3 parts, 3 actions. Anterior part, shoulder flexion. If it keeps contracting, it's going to give you shoulder internal rotation. The middle portion is your main muscle for abduction. And the posterior deltoid will give you shoulder extension, and if it keeps on contracting, it will give you external or lateral rotation of the shoulder joint. Now we're going to the second muscle on your master list, the Latissimus dorsi. There is a left and a right, huge back muscle. Dorsi it's named dorsi because it is in the dorsal part of your body. It's the back side. So basically, it's the trapezius is the huge muscle superiorly, and latissimus dorsi starts basically at your armpits and ends right here in the sacrum. Huge back muscle. It's a thin muscle, but it's huge. This white stuff here, this is the aponeurosis where all the muscle fibers are going to be originating from. So let's have a look at this guy. So the origin. The origin is huge. It's basically down the spine from the spinous process of T7, and it's going to go all the way down through the lumbar vertebrae and onto the back side of the sacrum. It's going to go into the posterior sacrum and then up into the posterior iliac crest, and then it does some stuff with the ribs that I don't really care about, but it does originate into ribs 8 through 12. And look at this insertion. The main thing I want you to look at is this insertion. It is going to be inserting on the humerus in the intertubercular groove. Some places call this the bicipital groove because of another reason, but I just want you to know it as the intertubercular groove, the groove in between the 2 tubercles. The greater and lesser tubercle, you've got that groove there. This is going to be important because there's going to be 3 muscles that are inserting in here that you're going to learn today. So it's inserting on the front side. This is the front of the humerus. It's wrapping and curving around to the front side. So when you're looking at this muscle, and you know it's moving the humerus, if we have, and look at the direction of those muscle fibers. If we have the humerus in the anatomical position, and it is pulling I to O, that will give you a net extension. It's going to pull the humerus back, give you extension of the shoulder joint, and also something you can't really visualize here, hard to visualize, But since this is inserting on the front of the humerus, as that muscle contracts, it's going to be pulling in this direction, and it will give you that internal or medial rotation. That is hard to visualize. It's just kind of pulling and wrapping inwards, internal or medial rotation. The other action your latissimus dorsi can give you is shoulder adduction. So here's showing you starting with your shoulder in the abducted position. It's in the coronal plane. It's been abducted. When the latissimus dorsi contracts, it's going to pull down the humerus. That will give you adduction. So if you're in the gym, that's why they call it the lat pull down. If you're doing a lat pull down, your arms are up and you're pulling it down. Those are the latissimus dorsi doing a lat pull down, aka adduction. The actions of the latissimus dorsi that I want you to put down, it's going to be extension of the arm, aka it's going to have action at the shoulder joint, so it's going to give you shoulder joint extension. It's going to be able to do medial rotation, medial inward rotation, and if your arms are up in an abducted position, the lats will be able to pull it back in, back down. That is adduction. So write those down on your list of actions. So the next muscle on your list is teres major. Now I call teres major the little brother of latissimus dorsi. Whatever action latissimus dorsi does, you are going to include teres major with him. So let's look at teres major. Here's latissimus dorsi. Here is teres major. So obviously you've got a right and a left and a right teres major. But let's isolate this guy so you can see his origins and insertions. Here is its origin. So teres major, the origin is basically at this inferior part of the scapula, the inferior angle, and look where it inserts into. It's going into that intertubercular groove right next to where latissimus dorsi is inserting. Latissimus dorsi is inserting around here, and then here's teres major. So they're basically inserting in the same place. So same thing, if you have contraction of this muscle, it's going to pull the humerus back. That will give you shoulder joint extension. If it continues to pull, and remember it's pulling from the front, it's going to pull and give you internal or medial rotation. And if your shoulder joint was in the abducted position up here, it would pull it down. So exactly what latissimus dorsi actions, only not quite as big, the little brother of latissimus dorsi. Now, the next muscle on your list is pectoralis major. Obviously, you have a right and a left. Now, let's look at pectoralis major. Let's isolate this. So here is pectoralis major isolated. So let's look at the origin. So if you're following along on your master list, pectoralis major, we have this part up here, which is the medial part of the clavicle, and then we're going to have the sternal edge right here, its origin is on the cartilage of ribs 1 through 7 by the sternum, and then it's actually going to have some fibers that are going into the aponeurosis of the external oblique here. So this origin up front, wrapping around here, huge origin, and then these fibers, look at all these fibers. They're all converging into the humerus. Again, look, they're going in the intertubercular groove. So we have a muscle that's right next to it in that intertubercular groove is going to be latissimus dorsi, and then on the other side of latissimus dorsi, near the intertubercular groove, is going to be teres major. So all three muscles, latissimus dorsi, teres major, and pectoralis major, are basically in this same location of the humerus in or near the intertubercular groove. That will be important. So with this muscle, if you can I to O, remember I to O, if this muscle contracts, it is going to be pulling the humerus forward, so that will give you flexion at the shoulder joint. But if it continues pulling all the way towards the midline here, that is going to give you medial, aka internal rotation. Pulling here, going to give you medial internal rotation. Much easier to see here. So I went ahead and removed all the other muscles so you could see this. So basically, here is pectoralis major. Here is teres major, harder to see there. And here's latissimus dorsi. They are all inserting into this intertubercular groove. What does that mean? Basically, it means if your arm, your shoulder has been abducted, lifted up, all these muscles are going to be pulling that arm back down. So pectoralis major, teres major, latissimus dorsi, they are all going to be synergist for shoulder adduction. So you start in the abducted position, adduction. Start in the abducted position, adduction, latissimus dorsi, adduction, latissimus dorsi, teres major, adduction, also going to be with pectoralis major, adduction. I'll show you this part too. Since the latissimus dorsi, teres major, and pectoralis major are all inserted basically at that intertubercular groove, they are all giving you this motion, which is medial or internal rotation. It's pulling the head of the humerus inward. You can see it from the front. So this is pectoralis major, pulling, medially rotating. And remember, the anterior portion of the deltoid is also helping with that internal or medial rotation. So what you should have on your list right now for internal medial rotation will be Pectoralis major, Latissimus dorsi, and remember, whenever you put down Latissimus dorsi, put down his little brother, Teres major, and the anterior portion of the deltoid. For shoulder extension, you should have Latissimus dorsi, obviously Teres major, his little brother, and the posterior portion of the deltoid. So those should all be for shoulder extension. You're going to be adding another muscle. No, it has a star on it. It's actually going to be the triceps brachii. This muscle, mainly we're concerned with it because it crosses two joints, and the elbow is what we usually think with triceps, that it's a mover of elbow extension. But it also crosses the shoulder joint, so if you want to, you can go ahead and put triceps brachii, because the triceps brachii does cross the shoulder joint and does have action of shoulder extension also. So all those muscles, the posterior portion of the deltoid, Latissimus dorsi, Teres major, and the triceps brachii, those are all synergists for shoulder extension. And what you should also have on your list by now is for shoulder flexion. You should have, let's do shoulder flexion coming forward. You should have the anterior portion of the deltoid. You should have pectoralis major. And this muscle that we'll talk about when we get to elbow joint, the biceps brachii. The biceps brachii also crosses both the shoulder and the elbow joint, so it will have action at the shoulder joint also, and it will help. It will be a synergist with the pectoralis major and the anterior portion of the deltoid. Those are all synergists for shoulder flexion. Now we're going to go to the 4 muscles that make up your rotator cuff. So on the left side here, I've removed the trapezius and the deltoid and the latissimus dorsi and some arm muscles. So we can just look at the rotator cuff muscles. So there's 4 of them. Start at the top. This is supraspinatus. Why do you think they call it supraspinatus? Because it is above the spine of the scapula. It is sitting in that supraspinous fossa. Look at where it's inserting. Its insertion, the supraspinatus, is at the greater tubercle of the humerus, way up here. The greater tubercle of the humerus. Its origin is in this supraspinous fossa. So, insertion, origin. If you can imagine I to O, what is that going to give you? I to O. That will give you shoulder abduction. Now there's a muscle that sits right on top of the supraspinatus. What muscle is that? the deltoid. Remember, the middle portion of the deltoid is right here. So the middle portion of the deltoid and the supraspinatus are going to be the two muscles that will give you shoulder abduction. So this is going to show you shoulder abduction. So we know it's going to be the middle portion of the deltoid right there. And if we fade, if we fade the muscles, here you can also see that it's when we are lifting our shoulder up, that supraspinatus muscle is also activated. So shoulder abduction, supraspinatus, and the middle portion of the deltoid gives you shoulder abduction. The next muscle, infraspinatus. Why do they call it infraspinatus? It is inferior to the spine of the scapula. Its insertion is also where? Infraspinatus on the greater tubercle of the humerus. So here's supraspinatus, infraspinatus. Here's its origin here. So can you imagine, can you figure out the action of the infraspinatus? I pulled to O. I pulled to O. That will give you what? That will give you lateral or external rotation at the shoulder joint. And then we're going to do this guy, which is teres minor. Teres minor. Now, his insertion is also the greater tubercle of the humerus. Let me isolate this guy. Turn around. And look, this is his origin over here. So, teres minor, the lateral border of the scapula, just a small portion right here. But he is also inserting, and it should be, this is the greater tubercle of the humerus. So let's look at him. What would his action be? I to O. Same thing as infraspinatus. That is also going to give you lateral or external rotation of the head of the humerus in that shoulder joint. So for external or lateral rotation, so let's kind of look at our arm. Here is external lateral rotation. You are going to have infraspinatus. Let's do it again. External, infraspinatus, teres minor, and what else? The posterior portion of the deltoid. So those are all going to give you external or lateral rotation. So, supraspinatus, above the spine. Infraspinatus, below the spine. Teres minor. Do not confuse teres minor with teres major. Teres major does not insert up here by the greater tubercle. Remember, teres major is inserting in that intertubercular groove. Totally different. Teres minor. Now we're going to do, there's one last rotator cuff muscle, and it is the subscapularis. The subscapularis, it is in that subscapular fossa of the scapula. Its insertion is on the lesser tubercle. So let's isolate that. So its insertion is on the lesser tubercle. Here's the greater tubercle. Here's the lesser tubercle. So when this subscapularis contracts, it's going to be pulling this lesser tubercle in this direction, I to O. That is going to give us what? That is going to give us medial rotation. It's going to be pulling in this direction. So medial rotation with the subscapularis. So here are our internal rotation muscles. First one, look at your list. You should have been writing these down. So internal rotation, you're going to have pectoralis minor. You're going to have latissimus dorsi. And you're going to have Teres major. He goes wherever latissimus dorsi goes. You're going to have the anterior portion of the deltoid. And you can kind of see your subscapularis in there. Let me fade all the other ones. So now you can see subscapularis in there too. So all those muscles, pectoralis major, latissimus dorsi, his little brother, Teres major, the anterior portion of the deltoid, and subscapularis, those are all synergists for internal rotation. So your 4 rotator cuff muscles: subscapularis, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor. Their other function, besides their action, they are basically wrapping around the head of the humerus to keep it in that shallow glenoid fossa. So we say they are stabilizing the shoulder joint so it doesn't dislocate, doesn't pop out of its shallow fossa. So that's it for the movers of the humerus. And now it will be on to movers of the elbow joint.